Story 1. I used to work the night shift at a rehab facility situated in a rough part of town. The streets outside were as unforgiving as the patients we cared for. Despite the grittiness of the environment, I took immense pride in the work we did. The facility itself was an aging, creaky building, with flickering lights that seemed straight out of a horror film. Yet, I pushed aside the eerie ambience and concentrated on my responsibilities, monitoring the patients and preventing any disturbances. But trouble had a way of finding us, and the patients would often get restless, leading to incidents that required my intervention. One night, while I was at my desk watching the surveillance monitors, I noticed a man standing outside the gate. He was large, with a scruffy beard and a menacing glare. His intense focus on the camera made me uneasy. Initially, I dismissed him as just another local troublemaker, but his unyielding gaze and prolonged presence stirred a sense of dread within me. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Concerned, I decided to use the intercom to address him. "Hey, buddy, do you need some help?" I asked, trying to sound as friendly as possible. He didn't respond, continuing to stare at the camera as if in a trance. Growing more unsettled, I called my coworker, Mike, for a second opinion. "What do you make of this guy?" I asked Mike, showing him the footage. His face turned serious as he studied the monitor. "I don't like it," he said. "Let's go check it out." We approached the gate, and the man was still there, his gaze unwavering. Despite our attempts to engage him, he remained unresponsive, seemingly rooted to the spot. We decided to leave him alone, hoping he would eventually move on. However, he remained there for hours, his presence casting a sinister shadow over the facility. Eventually, he disappeared without a trace. We conducted a thorough search of the area, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was real and that he might return. The remainder of the night passed quietly, but a lingering sense of unease stayed with me. As my shift was ending, I glanced outside the gate and, to my horror, saw him again. He was standing there, staring up at the camera. I knew then that something was coming for me. In a panic, I rushed inside, locked the door, and called the police. When they arrived, there was no sign of the man. He had disappeared once more, leaving no trace behind. I never saw him again, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The incident was so unsettling that I decided to quit my job the next day. The sense of being stalked had become unbearable. That experience remains etched in my memory. The man's eerie presence and the chilling reminder that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real haunt me. I will never forget that night and the way it altered my perception of safety and reality. Story 2. I was buried in work late at the office, absorbed in an important project that had to be finished by morning. It was past 2 a.m., and the building was a ghost town. Every other desk was vacant, the hum of the air conditioning the only consistent noise. The lights overhead buzzed intermittently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. As I typed away, my mind drifted to the rumors I'd heard about this place. Supposedly, it was built over an old Indian burial ground, and people whispered about ghostly presences and eerie occurrences. I had always been skeptical of such stories. Superstitions and urban legends meant little to me. But tonight, alone in the vast, dimly lit office, those rumors started to gnaw at the edges of my rational mind. The silence was oppressive, almost tangible. Every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified in the stillness. I shook off a sudden chill that ran down my spine, attributing it to fatigue rather than fear. I glanced around the room, rows of empty cubicles, chairs left neatly pushed in, and the occasional stray document scattered about. I was alone, or so I believed. Then, without warning, a faint sound broke the silence. It was a soft, unsettling creak, as if the floorboards were shifting beneath me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was merely the old building settling. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct, taking on the rhythmic quality of footsteps echoing through the empty space. My heart started to race. I stood up, my instincts urging me to investigate, but I was paralyzed by a mixture of curiosity and dread. As I approached the source of the noise, the lights overhead flickered wildly before plunging the room into darkness. My pulse quickened, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. The darkness was suffocating, amplifying every tiny sound, making every shadow seem like a moving threat. I tried to stay calm, but my hands shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the office in harsh, stark light. The empty cubicles seemed even more alien and menacing. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of my cubicle. It was tall, its outline indistinct but menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the gloom like twin lanterns in the dark. A wave of terror washed over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them again, the figure would be gone. But when I dared to open my eyes, the figure was still there, moving closer. Its form was more defined now, though still shrouded in an unsettling darkness. I could make out its tall, gaunt frame, and the eyes, those horrifying, glowing eyes, seemed to follow my every movement. I wanted to call for help, but my voice remained trapped, silent in the heavy air. Just as the figure reached out a spectral hand, the lights flickered back on. The abrupt transition from darkness to light was blinding, and when my vision cleared, the figure was gone. The office was silent once more, the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioning. My heart was still pounding as I stumbled back to my desk, gathering my things with shaking hands. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over me felt like a heavy weight pressing down. I packed up my belongings with a newfound urgency, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. The shadows in the office seemed to move on their own, twisting and turning as if alive. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I left the building with the sense that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. The darkened windows of the office building loomed behind me, and I half expected to see the shadowy figure staring back, waiting for me to return. As I made my way to my car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, but the windows were empty. I drove home with a heavy heart, the eerie encounter replaying in my mind. I knew I would never be able to explain what I saw or experienced that night. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it as exhaustion or imagination, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had been present in that office. The next morning, I was a bundle of nerves, unable to focus on anything but the previous night's events. I resolved to keep the experience to myself, worried that if I told anyone, they would dismiss it as stress-induced hallucinations or fabricate their own rational explanations. My colleagues noticed my unusual demeanor, but I brushed off their concerns with vague answers. I couldn't afford to seem unhinged, especially given the importance of the project I had been working on. In the weeks that followed, I avoided staying late at the office, making excuses to leave before dark. I never spoke of the incident, though the fear and unease never entirely left me. The building's unsettling reputation seemed all too real now, and I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever had been in that office was still out there, waiting in the shadows. Even now, as I think back on that night, I wonder if the shadowy figure might return. It's a haunting thought that lingers, a reminder of that dark, silent night when I came face to face with something beyond the realm of the ordinary. Story 3. I worked for a small, relatively unknown security firm that specialized in patrolling vacant properties to ensure their safety. My name is Tom, and while the job typically involved little more than routine checks and quiet nights, one October evening stands out as an exception. That night, I was assigned to monitor an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, a place with a reputation for being unsettling, even among seasoned locals. From the moment I arrived at the hospital, I felt an unusual chill in the air. The building stood isolated, surrounded by a dense, overgrown thicket of trees that seemed to close in on it. The wind whistled through the broken windows and shattered glass crunched underfoot as I made my way through the front entrance. The silence inside was profound, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the howling of the wind through the empty halls. Despite my best efforts to remain focused on the task at hand, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The hospital was a massive structure, its once grand appearance now marred by decay and neglect. Flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the stale, musty air was almost suffocating. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of dread. This was just another routine job, and I was determined not to let my nerves get the best of me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness seemed to swallow the hospital whole. My rounds began, each step echoing in the cavernous spaces as I moved through the building. I checked every floor, meticulously documenting my findings. The upper levels were relatively uneventful, but as I descended towards the basement, a growing sense of unease began to gnaw at me. The basement was different. The temperature dropped noticeably as I descended the stairs, and the air grew thick with an oppressive heaviness. The only illumination came from the beam of my flashlight, which cut through the darkness in narrow swaths. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air was so musty that I could almost taste the dampness. It was then that I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate from the very walls of the basement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I convinced myself that it was nothing more than the building settling or the wind playing tricks on me. But as the growl echoed again, closer this time, my rationalizations began to crumble. The sound was unmistakable and carried an unsettling, predatory tone that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me, and I began to back away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had heard. That's when I saw them, eyes. Not just one pair, but multiple pairs of glowing eyes peering out from the inky darkness. They were scattered across the shadows, reflecting the beam of my flashlight in a way that made it impossible to discern their source. A scream escaped my lips before I could stop it, and I turned to flee. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But just as I tried to make my escape, something grabbed my ankle with a force that felt like iron. I was yanked off my feet, the world spinning as I was pulled down into the darkness. Desperate, I fought back with all my strength, but the grip on my ankle was relentless. It dragged me further into the basement's depths, the growls growing louder and more intense. My flashlight fell from my hand, its beam flickering out as I tumbled through the darkness. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking just out of sight, each growl sending shivers down my spine. Just when I thought I would be lost to the darkness forever, the grip on my ankle suddenly released. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing and breath coming in ragged gasps. My flashlight lay shattered on the floor, but I didn't care. I bolted towards the stairs, ignoring the stinging pain in my limbs as I climbed as fast as I could. Bursting out of the basement, I stumbled into the main floor of the hospital, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. The oppressive atmosphere of the basement seemed to cling to me, but I didn't dare look back. I raced through the corridors, my only thought being to get out of the building as quickly as possible. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a splash of cold water, and I gulped it down greedily. I glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see whatever had attacked me emerging from the shadows in pursuit. But the building stood silent and foreboding, its dark silhouette outlined against the starless sky. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything had followed me. Shaking uncontrollably, I made my way to my car and drove away from the hospital. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. The next day, I resigned from my position, citing a need for a break. But the truth was far different. I couldn't bring myself to admit the real reason for my departure, the profound terror of what I had encountered in that forsaken place. To this day, the growl echoes in my nightmares, a haunting reminder of the horrors that lie just beyond the edge of perception. I often wonder what I truly encountered in that basement, and whether those glowing eyes were the last remnants of a forgotten nightmare or something far more sinister. The abandoned hospital remains a dark shadow in my past, a place I hope never to return to. Story 4. A few years ago, I worked as a security guard at City Hall. The job was typically mundane, filled with routine checks and long stretches of silence, but one night, everything changed. My role required me to patrol various parts of the building, including the basement where the old jail cells were located. These cells hadn't been in use for decades, and they had a reputation for being unsettling. I was just starting to get used to the peculiarities of the place, but on one particular night, things took a dark and inexplicable turn. The basement corridor where the cells were located was narrow and dimly lit. The walls seemed to close in, and the flickering light bulbs cast unsettling, dancing shadows that made the place feel even more oppressive. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional hum of the old lights and the distant clatter of the building settling. That night, as I made my way through the dimly lit corridor, I was on my second patrol alone in this part of the building. The air was thick with a musty smell, a remnant of years of neglect. As I passed the fourth row of cells, a sudden, unsettling darkness engulfed the hallway. The lights went out without warning, plunging me into an eerie blackness. My heart skipped a beat, and I fumbled with the flashlight at my side, trying to get a better view. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling with a mix of anxiety and confusion. Just as I was about to flip the switch to restore light, the bulbs flickered back on. The brief flash of illumination made the shadows on the walls twist and writhe, adding to the growing sense of dread that clung to me like a cold sweat. Deciding it was best to finish my patrol and return to the relative safety of the main lobby, I steeled myself and continued down the corridor. But as soon as I moved a few steps further, the lights failed again. This time, the darkness was more profound, and I could hear the unnerving sound of metal clanging. My ears strained, and I distinctly heard the sound of two cells slamming shut with a force that echoed through the corridor. My pulse quickened, and panic began to set in. I gripped my flashlight tightly, its beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the hallway. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, amplifying every creak and groan of the building. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. I reached the door to the main lobby, slammed it shut behind me, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. The main lobby was bustling with people, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the basement. The crowd and the activity provided a temporary reprieve from the terror I had just experienced. I took a moment to compose myself, but the lingering fear was hard to shake off. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor, my voice trembling as I asked if there had been any reported electrical issues in the building. To my dismay, he informed me that there were no known problems. His voice was calm and dismissive, and I struggled to convey the strange occurrences I had just witnessed. He reassured me that it was likely a malfunction or a glitch, but his words did little to ease my anxiety. The feeling of paranoia began to seep in, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was watching me from the shadows. The next 2 hours of my shift were a blur of unease. I patrolled the other areas of the building, but my mind was consumed by the events of the basement. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed more sinister. The ordinary noises of the building became sources of dread, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. When my shift finally ended, I wasted no time in leaving. I practically bolted out of the building, eager to put as much distance between myself and the basement as possible. The experience had shaken me to my core, and I vowed never to return to those old cells. The fear of what might be lurking in that dark, abandoned part of City Hall stayed with me long after I had left the building. In the weeks that followed, I made every effort to avoid the basement. Whenever I was in City Hall, I stayed far away from that part of the building. The mere thought of the narrow corridor and those old, creaky cells was enough to make my skin crawl. Even as time passed and I eventually left my job at City Hall, the memories of that night continued to haunt me. The most unsettling part of the experience was the way it lingered in my mind. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the sound of those cells slamming shut in the dead of night. It's a chilling reminder of that eerie night and the inexplicable events that unfolded in the basement. The echoes of those slamming doors seem to follow me, a constant reminder that something may still be waiting in the shadows of that forsaken corridor. Though I no longer work at City Hall, the fear of that night has stayed with me, a shadow that looms in the back of my mind. The basement of City Hall remains a place I avoid in my thoughts, a dark and mysterious corner of my past that I hope will never again come to light.